We're staying with young. Next up, OYW, which stands for One Young World. It's the brainchild of Kate Robertson. She was South African born, but she's living in London these past 20-odd years. But here she is, back in the studio here in Cape Town. She came up with this idea, though, to get young people across the world to meet up with each other and share ideas. And I think that the inaugural OYW was held in London in February earlier this year. Kate, lovely to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Nancy.
So the first one was held in London in February, and I think the next one is coming up next year in Switzerland.
Yes, in Zurich.
Okay. Why have you chosen... let's start at the beginning. Why?
The talking shops, if you like, for government leaders and business leaders, incumbent leaders all over the world, and there are many of them, it seems to us, are not delivering solutions. And I think there's a reason for that. As a business leader myself, and I run the 12 companies of Euro in the UK, we are beholden to quarterly results, or if you're a government leader, to get yourself re-elected or clinging on to power if you're not democratically elected. And it is a short-term thing. It's just what we're driven by. And it seemed to us that if you looked at things like particularly systemic risk, you would say that a young person would take a longer-term view of that. And we were setting ourselves a challenge. If we asked young people what they thought the solutions are, what the issues are that they wanted solved, could we as business leaders, as political leaders, turn our hand to that and look after the long term? So if you like, it was a maverick but ideological proposition in its first instance. But when we took it to great world leaders like Desmond Tutu, like Muhammad Yunus, Kofi Annan, Bob Geldof, to try to test it out, these guys just said, it's absolutely the right thesis. Where do you want us? We're going to be there. Which was tremendous encouragement, and actually I thought quite a surprising thing, except those guys are such great leaders themselves. But these leaders who are prepared to turn over their stature and lend their stature to very young leaders saying, you know what, they might just have a better idea. So it's unorthodox, if you like.
You've certainly got some guys at the top there, and I'd be interested to know if there were any women at the top there, but we'll get to that in just a minute. But interesting that you've got people who are there to sort of pass on their sage advice and help these young people. But what we just heard there from Lorato, and you were nodding your head too, is it's really important to talk to the young people to find out what their issues are. So the purpose of that first mini Davos, or young Davos, was to find out what their issues are, and what are their issues?
Well, what we'd done was, and the reason I was nodding so vigorously to that point was, we polled 15,000 young people in 34 countries prior to the summit, saying to them, what are the major issues that you think humankind faces? So top of that list, absolutely, number one was poverty, followed by global health, the environment, the role of global business in society, interfaith tolerance and dialogue, changing role of the media, and developing positive leadership. So what we did was we said poverty is really the catch-all, and the next 6 addressed would start to address global poverty. So we took a slight step around on that one. And then what we did was, from the responses from 15,000, which the polling was conducted for us by YouGov, so it's not us doing it, it's independently done. YouGov themselves and the James Martin School at Oxford University analysed the results and drafted the draft resolutions around those 6 topics, which are very broad, anodyne resolutions, if you like, draft resolutions. And then we said to the over 800 delegates who were due at the first summit, do you want to speak to this topic? Do you want to speak from the floor on this topic? And then the delegate speakers were introduced by Desmond and Kofi and Bob and Mohammed. So tremendous status being imparted to the young speakers. When they spoke from the floor, the leaders we call the councillors, Clarence Seedorf, Dr. Ann Johnson, Yasmin Alibi Brown, Nick Haysom, who used to be Madiba's lawyer, were on the floor with Kofi and the other guys holding the microphone for the kids. So there's a lot of status when Kofi Annan's holding the microphone for you to speak. But everything was done that the resolution was their resolution, that if they voted to pass it, they then, as One Young World ambassadors, we suggested to them, because you can't tell them what to do, have a duty to deliver behind that resolution. But there's nothing in the content that was coming from any older people. all of the content was exactly to the point you were making with I'm a Winner, is what did they want and what do they think? And we tried really hard to stay with that.
15,000 young people from 30-odd countries is going some, but it sounds like they would have been articulate, educated young people, and I'm thinking if poverty is top of their list of issues, did we have any impoverished young people?
Do you know, a wonderful thing happens? Absolutely the right question, because we get asked this, is it elitist? And, you know, to a degree, it absolutely it is. It is a leadership elite, but in the YouTube outreach, because Desmond Tutu helped us with that before the first summit, we had 3 NGOs in Uganda banded together to fund the participation of a former child soldier from Uganda who is a child who has lived in poverty. We had a boy who was sent by an NGO in southern Sudan, and they only had part of the funding, and oddly enough, and I thought it was marvellous, the Sudanese government stepped in for the rest of his funding. It's a boy called Omar, and he's always remembered because he's about 6'6", who at one point in a commentary session stepped up to the microphone next to Ken Costa, who's the chairman of Lazard. He's a South African, stepped up to the microphone and said, I wanted to thank everybody for having me here. All I wanted to say is that I'm from Darfur and I'm alive.
Goodness me. You talk about a lot about the male mentors, if you like, the young men that you've come across. What about young women? I'm sort of in a way kind of surprised that on that list, and maybe there's subtext or subheads, that there may have been women's health issues, certainly unemployment, isn't there? But thinking about women's issues, did you get any women top knobs to come and talk? And what was the breakdown of the gender of the young people there?
The delegates was just over half of them were women. Very interesting. Watching the youngsters during the summits, very, very interesting. You had no gender issues there. There's this generation, there's even leadership, and yes, as I say, at quite a highly educated level, but it was interesting. With the women councillors, this is an issue, this is absolutely an issue. We had started out with a very clear list of the people we wanted to get, and you know, when you knew and you don't have funding to bring people, those guys are a long shot because the diaries are booked for 10 years in advance. And obviously we wanted to get Melinda Gates and Queen Rania, Indra Nooyi from Pepsi.
Graça Machel springs to mind.
Graça Machel, absolutely. We didn't get there. Queen Rania said to David Jones, who's my boss, who's really the driver behind making us do Change for Good. Queen Rania said to us in Davos last year that the reality was that there are so few women who are recognized global leaders that you really can't get them. I'm very, very optimistic that we get Melinda Gates, Sheikha Moza and Queen Rania this time around, Indra Nooyi. I really am optimistic about it. I mean, we're both about to sign some appointment letters and stuff, so I don't want to say I've got them because that's not true, but we're nearly there. And that's generational now at the moment. But women's issues did not come up specifically from the age group. So I think that's an interesting one, not at the top of the list, the top 6 that we picked. But some of the young women who were there, we have a Nigerian, the ambassador, one young world ambassador, convening ambassador for Nigeria. It's a young woman called Anjara Bada, who's now 23, who is a nurse who put together, out of no funding at all, a little handmade bag that you carry over your shoulder with a sharpened implement for cutting an umbilical cord, some sterile wipes, and 48 hours of antibiotic supplies, because she said as a nurse, women dying in childbirth, it's not the doctor they don't have, it's the basics. She's distributed over 2 million of these. And the Nigerian NGOs say she's got to have saved 250,000 lives. You know, she'd done this when she was 22. So some of the women at One Young World were just everything a human leader can be.
The word that you use there is that there are not enough recognised women out there, which doesn't mean that they aren't out there. They are out there. There could be many Anjara Badas, and I'm sure there are, certainly here in Africa. It's just Wangari Maathai also. You know, there are so many women doing things.
We so nearly got Wangari, but it was such a difficult, because we were early February, and Wangari Maathai and all of those people with Kofi, you know, they'd just been Copenhagen, and things were quite kind of rough on diaries
sort of
at the time.
Conferenced out.
Just rough.
The most important thing is what's happening next. exist, and how and why are young people here in South Africa can somehow get involved? Do they YouTube? Do they go onto the website? What's the story?
Straight to oneyoungworld.com. There's Facebook applications there. There's YouTube. There's everything you could possibly want to know. There is a network of thousands of applicants there, plus the network of the 800 ambassadors who attended this year, some of whom will be coming back next year. So everything's there. Issue being, and why I particularly wanted to talk to you, is that Africa as a whole and South Africa were underrepresented. Why? Because it takes money to attend the summit. It might be easy for someone in Australia or China or the States, not so in Africa. However, for me, some of the greatest leaders in the world have come out of South Africa. And my plea to South African corporates is, if the great South African corporates don't lead for Africa, then who will?
I hope you're listening, corporates, and I hope young leaders, you equally are listening, because if you have something to say and if you feel that there's something that you could be offering, maybe you should just check that website as a start of a 10, www.oneyoungworld.com, oneyoungworld, written out in letters.com. Very briefly, last question is, what will the outcome be? I mean, that we've just had the first, planning the second. What are we going to come up with? A list of sort of like a constitution of some sort that will be distributed worldwide?
They have come up with what they call the Zurich Declaration, which talks to next year, which is sharper than the resolutions. But the biggest thing is what the Interfaith Dialogue presented it at the United Nations with Ban Ki-moon in the chamber just a month ago. One of the South African delegates who's at UCT, Sizwe, came back inspired and got hold of 23 universities in 11 countries and held the first African Universities Leadership Summit here himself at Cape Town University in September this year. And those are two examples of over 100 initiatives that these youngsters are doing alone, unfunded and undriven by us. They're driving it themselves. They say they're beholden and accountable to one another, but they are a phenomenal force of leaders for good.
Sounds like the tip of one unstoppable iceberg, and may it never melt and just grow bigger and bigger. Gosh, Kate, that's absolutely fantastic. Kate Robertson, certainly something to look into. So if you would, if you've perhaps got a young person in your circle, maybe you should just check it all out. Kate Robertson, looking to get some input from South Africa. So come on, South African corporate, do what you can there for our young people. www.oneyoungworld.com. Well, stay with us, because in a minute we're going to be talking about craft as business here on Otherwise. So just stick around. But right now it's 1:30. It's time for the news headlines on SAFM with Vibhashni Chetty.
Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon. The new members of Cabinet will be sworn in shortly at the Presidential Guest House in Pretoria. Yesterday, President Jacob Zuma announced a major Cabinet reshuffle, which saw 7 ministers axed from Cabinet. 4 suspects have been killed in a shootout with police at Inanda, north of Durban. Police spokesperson Vincent Mdunge says a gang of armed men robbed a Fidelity security vehicle transporting an undisclosed amount of cash at Ndwedwe, north of the city. And on the international front, U.S. President Barack Obama faces a crucial electoral test this week. Americans will vote in midterm elections tomorrow, with Obama's Democratic Party likely to lose seats in Congress. Details with Greg House at 2.
Thanks very much. But right now you were listening to Otherwise, talking women here on SAFM, and we're also busy talking. We forgot about the microphone.